What you are about to hear is the story of a forbidden love between a noblewoman and a humble gardener, set in a secluded Victorian garden, where passion defies society's rigid expectations. The sun filtered gently through the canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows over the secluded Victorian garden. Lady Eleanor stood among the roses, her gloved hands delicately brushing against the soft petals. The estate garden was vast, an oasis of beauty and peace, but for Eleanor, it had become a prison of expectations. Born into an aristocratic family, her life had been mapped out since birth. Her future husband, Lord Andrew, a man of wealth and stature, had been chosen for her long ago. Though she knew her duty, Eleanor could not suppress the growing ache in her chest, a longing for a life she had never been allowed to imagine. That afternoon, as she wandered further into the garden, a soft sound of rustling drew her attention. She turned to see a figure kneeling by the hedges, tending to the flowers with a gentle touch. It was Thomas, the estate's humble gardener, his hands earthy and rough, yet filled with a tenderness that belied his station. Eleanor had seen him before. Of course, he had worked the grounds for years, but they had never spoken beyond a polite greeting. But today, something was different. As Thomas rose to his feet and their eyes met, Eleanor felt an inexplicable pull, something in the quiet intensity of his gaze that made her heart flutter. For a moment, the rigid expectations of her life seemed to fall away, leaving only the soft rustle of the leaves and the intoxicating scent of the roses. "Good afternoon, my lady," Thomas said quietly, bowing his head. Eleanor's voice trembled as she replied, "Good afternoon, Thomas." She hesitated for a moment before asking, "You tend to these roses so carefully. How long have you been the gardener here?" Thomas smiled softly, a glint of pride in his eyes. "Nearly a decade, my lady. I know every inch of this garden, the flowers, the trees, the secrets they keep." "Secrets?" Eleanor's curiosity piqued. Thomas gestured toward the blooms surrounding them. "There's much the garden reveals if one knows how to listen. It speaks of life, of growth, of beauty born from struggle." The metaphor was not lost on Eleanor. She felt the weight of her own struggle, the suffocating expectations of her privileged life pressing in on her. And yet, standing here with Thomas, she felt something else, the faint stirrings of possibility, of escape. Their conversation began to flow more easily, a quiet connection forming between them as they spoke of the garden, of life, of dreams neither dared to voice fully. As the hours passed, they lost themselves in each other's presence, the sun sinking lower in the sky. But as dusk approached, the weight of reality returned. Eleanor's thoughts turned to her upcoming engagement to Lord Andrew, a match her family had orchestrated with precision. She was expected to marry him within months, a union of wealth and status that would solidify her place in society. But now, after this afternoon with Thomas, the prospect of that life felt unbearable. Their meetings in the garden became more frequent, and what began as innocent conversation soon grew into something far more dangerous. Eleanor found herself drawn to Thomas in a way she had never known before. His quiet strength, his unspoken kindness, everything about him called to her, and she could feel herself falling. But with every secret glance, every stolen touch, the threat of discovery loomed over them like a storm. The days in the garden became Eleanor's only refuge, her time with Thomas the only moments when she could truly breathe. Every morning, she would find herself waiting impatiently for the chance to slip away from the suffocating confines of the manor to meet him among the roses where they could hide from the world, if only for a little while. Their conversations deepened, and with each meeting, the tension between them grew thick and palpable. What began as gentle smiles and stolen glances soon turned into lingering touches. Fingers brushing against each other, they walked along the flowered paths. They spoke of dreams, Thomas of the simple life he longed for, a life free from servitude, and Eleanor of the suffocating weight of expectations of her impending engagement to Lord Andrew, a man she could not love. One afternoon, beneath the sprawling oak tree that marked the farthest corner of the garden, Eleanor's resolve finally began to crack. She stood close to Thomas, her breath quickening as she felt his warmth, the scent of earth and flowers clinging to his skin. She had never felt more alive, but with that feeling came fear of discovery, fear of what would happen if anyone learned of their connection. "I feel like I'm losing myself," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My whole life has been planned for me, and I don't know if I can do it anymore." Thomas's brow furrowed, concern evident in his deep brown eyes. "You don't have to live like this, Eleanor. You deserve to be free to choose your own path." Tears welled in her eyes. "But how can I? I am bound to my family's expectations. Lord Andrew will come for me soon, and I am expected to marry him, to be the perfect wife, the perfect lady." Thomas hesitated for a moment before gently taking her hand in his. "What if you didn't have to?" he asked softly, his voice filled with both hope and desperation. "What if we left? You and I together. We could start a new life somewhere far away from here, away from all of this." His words sent a jolt through her. It was a dream she had never dared to imagine: freedom, a life of her own choosing. The very thought of it made her heart race, but it was also terrifying. The world outside of the estate was unknown to her, a place she had been sheltered from all her life. And yet, standing here with Thomas, she felt a spark of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Could we really do that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "We could. I would go anywhere with you, Eleanor. All we need is each other." Their lips met for the first time in the shadow of the oak tree, a kiss filled with all the passion and longing they had kept hidden for so long. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they wanted but couldn't have, of the impossible love that had blossomed between them in secret. For a few moments, the world disappeared, and there was only them, their hearts pounding in unison, their souls intertwined. But as they pulled apart, reality came crashing back down around them. The world beyond the garden was still there, waiting, filled with the expectations and pressures that threatened to tear them apart. Days passed, and as their love deepened, so too did the pressure from Eleanor's family. Her father had grown impatient, eager to solidify her engagement to Lord Andrew. Rumors had begun to spread about Eleanor's reluctance, whispers that reached the ears of her mother, who had always been more astute than Eleanor would have liked. One evening, as Eleanor prepared for yet another dinner where Lord Andrew's presence loomed, her mother entered her chambers, her face stern but unreadable. "You've been spending quite a bit of time in the garden, Eleanor," she remarked casually, but there was a sharp edge to her tone. Eleanor's heart raced, her hands gripping the edges of her vanity. "Yes, Mother. It's peaceful there. I've always enjoyed the flowers." Her mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "Peaceful, perhaps, but the staff talk. They've noticed your frequent meetings with the gardener." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She turned to face her mother, forcing a smile. "We've spoken, yes. He's been tending to the roses." Her mother's gaze was piercing, as though she could see straight through Eleanor's thin thought. "You are promised to Lord Andrew, Eleanor. It would be wise to remember that. The family's reputation must not be tarnished by improper relationships. The warning was clear. Eleanor's heart clenched in her chest as she watched her mother leave the room, her carefully composed expression betraying nothing. Fear gripped her. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before their secret was discovered. If her family knew the depth of her feelings for Thomas, the consequences would be disastrous for both of them. That night, Eleanor met Thomas in the garden, her heart heavy with the weight of her mother's words. As she fell into his arms, the scent of roses filling the night air, she whispered, "We need to leave, Thomas. They know. It's only a matter of time before they separate us." Thomas pulled her close, his arms wrapping protectively around her. "We'll go, Eleanor. We'll leave tonight." The plan was set. They would slip away in the dead of night, leaving behind the estate, the life Eleanor had known, and the expectations that had chained her. But as they kissed under the stars, a shadow moved in the distance, watching, waiting. The night air was thick with tension as Eleanor and Thomas hurriedly made their way through the moonlit garden, the roses that had once symbolized their secret love now standing as silent witnesses to their escape. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl seemed magnified, echoing the thundering of Eleanor's heart. They had packed little, knowing they could not carry much if they were to slip away unnoticed. Eleanor wore a simple cloak over her gown, her hands trembling as she clutched Thomas's arm. They had planned to take the servants' path through the back of their estate, a narrow route used by the workers to come and go unnoticed by the aristocratic eyes of the household. It had been Thomas's idea. A gardener knew the estate better than anyone. After all, but as they neared the gate, a flicker of doubt crept into Eleanor's mind. Could they really leave everything behind? Was it even possible to escape the life she had been born into? Thomas seemed to sense her hesitation. He stopped, turning to face her, his hands gently cupping her face. "Eleanor," he whispered, "we don't have to do this. If you're not ready, if you're afraid, tell me." Her heart twisted at the sight of him so steadfast, so willing to risk everything for her. But the fear, the doubt, weighed heavily on her. She glanced back toward the manor, its grand silhouette standing stark against the night sky. Her family, Lord Andrew, the world she was leaving behind, it all loomed large in her mind, like chains pulling her back. "I'm afraid, Thomas," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm afraid of what will happen if we leave. And I'm afraid of what will happen if we stay." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the stillness of the night. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat as she heard voices, low, urgent whispers, and then a familiar, commanding tone. It was her father. "Eleanor," he called, his voice cold and unyielding. "Do not take another step." Eleanor's heart stopped. She turned, her eyes wide with fear, as her father emerged from the shadows, flanked by 2 servants and Lord Andrew, his expression dark with fury. "How dare you?" her father spat, his eyes narrowing on Thomas. "How dare you lay your hands on my daughter, you peasant?" Thomas stood his ground, his hand tightening around Eleanor's. "I love her," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the danger that now surrounded them. "I don't care about your wealth, your status. I love her." Her father's face twisted with disgust. "Love? This is not love. This is madness. Eleanor, you are promised to Lord Andrew, a man of proper standing. This man has no place in your life." Lord Andrew stepped forward, his eyes hard as he looked between Eleanor and Thomas. You would throw away everything, Eleanor. Your family's name, your future, all for him. Eleanor's mind spun, the weight of their words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Her father's anger, Andrew's betrayal, it was all too much. She clung to Thomas's hand, her heart breaking as the realization hit her. There was no escape. No matter how much she loved Thomas, the world they lived in would never allow them to be together. They would always be hunted, always be on the run, and she would be the one to drag him into a life of uncertainty and danger. "I don't want this," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Thomas. "But what choice do we have? How can we ever be free?" Thomas's eyes softened, his heart breaking at the sight of her despair. He knew the answer, even if he didn't want to admit it. They could never be free, not truly. Not in this world. But he also knew that he could not bear to see her suffer, to live in a world that would crush her spirit. "You deserve more," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "More than this. More than me." Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Thomas. You're all I want." But before she could say more, her father stepped forward, grabbing her arm with a force that made her wince. "This ends now," he growled. "You will return to the manor, and you will marry Lord Andrew as planned. You will forget this mistake." Thomas stepped forward, ready to defend her, but Eleanor shook her head, silently pleading with him to stop. "No, Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't. You'll only make it worse." He hesitated, torn between the desire to protect her and the crushing realization that he couldn't. No matter what he did, he could never give her the life she deserved. He could never protect her from the world that sought to control her. Her father began to pull her away, and as she looked back at Thomas, her heart shattered. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. They were supposed to escape, to be free. But the cruel reality of their world was too much, the chains of society too strong. "I love you," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with sorrow as she was dragged back toward the manor. Thomas watched, his heart breaking as she disappeared into the darkness. He wanted to run after her, to fight for her, but deep down, he knew the truth. They could never have been together, not in this life. The world they lived in had drawn a line between them, a line that love alone could not cross. As the garden fell silent once more, Thomas sank to his knees among the roses, the scent of their delicate petals filling the night air. He had loved her with everything he had, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. The garden, once a sanctuary of love and hope, now felt like a tomb filled with the echoes of a love that could never be. Eleanor returned to her life of privilege, her heart forever broken by the love she had lost. She married Lord Andrew as her family expected, but her heart remained in the garden, with the man she could never forget. And though the roses continued to bloom year after year, their beauty would forever remind her of the love that had withered beneath society's unyielding gaze.